Okay, I'm going to put this commentary into a separate video here because I ended up going on for a very long time. So this is my commentary on a 20-volume small... It's not very... 20 volumes makes it sound very long, but it's just a very small book that you get to read, basically, in Ebonhawke. This is the things I took away from it, the stuff I liked about it. There was a previous video that showed you the locations of all the stuff and where I read it out, so feel free to check that out. There'll be a link in the description. The first bit of this commentary appeared at the end of the other video. At the moment, I'm just talking about what the threat that Adelbern talked about to the south was and what was going on there. Why did he send the Ebon Vanguard to the south in the first place? So we're going to jump in where we left off. So he's sending them south, not telling them what threat it is that's there, just that there is one and that they need to defend themselves against it and they need to build up some kind of a fortification down there against it. And obviously that then turns out to be the Char. But did Adelbern know that this was the Char that were down there and he deliberately sent the people there? I mean, how could he have known that the Char were there? There is the question raised of whether they're Char that are left over from the assault on Or, and I think that's an interesting idea. I really like that, actually, because this is the first time ArenaNet have specifically acknowledged that the Char attacked Or all those years ago by going through the Crystal Desert. We had this information that the Char had attacked Or before, but then you kind of look at the map and you're like, well, how the hell did they get there? Did they form a navy and sail across the sea? Did they go through the Shiver Peaks? Or what did they do? Did they go through the Crystal Desert? And that seemed like a very odd thing, but the truth is, yes, they did march through the Crystal Desert, and here we have kind of, in a weird way, confirmation of that. But the question of whether the Char that they find to the south are left over from that force, I find very questionable, because that was a long time before. I mean, we're talking coming up on 10 years before the time when we finished the plot in Guild Wars 1, and this happened after that. Would they really have been left around for over a decade? I don't think so. So there is this question of why are there Char there, and how did Adelbern know about the Char that were there? And I guess the insinuation, therefore, might be that Adelbern maybe paid some Char off. We know that he's going insane at this point. If you read the book Ghosts of Ascalon, you find out a lot about how the death of his son kind of totally messed with his psyche and he started going a bit insane. There are obviously hints and stuff in this story, again, of how people might be fearing Adelbern. And there's also hints that he's sending away people that are doubting him. And all of that kind of adds up to me to make it sound like, well, Adelbern's just sent them there because he wants them killed. He wants the doubters out of his kingdom. And you might wonder, well, why is he sending the Ebon Vanguard that have been fighting the Char in the north down there if he's just trying to get rid of doubters and people that aren't useful to him? Well, actually, that does still kind of work out. I actually went back to a specific scene in Guild Wars 1 to think of this. But basically, when Eye of the North came out, as I say, we met the Ebon Vanguard, and they are actually the remnants. They're left over from Prince Rurik's Vanguard. So in life, Prince Rurik and Adelbern hated each other. The prince hated the king and the king didn't like the prince. And in the end, Adelbern, the king, exiled his son, Rurik. And Rurik then said, right, anyone that doesn't believe Adelbern can save Ascalon, come with me. We're all going to go to Kryta and we're going to have a new life there. So kind of the nation splits and a lot of people go with him across the mountains, right? And Rurik actually had his own private vanguard of Ascalon soldiers that all went with him. And in fact, as a Guild Wars 1 player, guess what? You were in this vanguard. You were a part of Rurik's vanguard. Now, the story goes that when Rurik then dies on the Shiver Peaks, Adelbern realises he's been a terrible father. He goes into insanity. But his force of people, a lot of them then go off to Kryta and they go and live their life, and then basically the events of prophecies continue. But his vanguard, a lot of the vanguard actually end up just moving their way north. They can't really go back to Ascalon, I suppose, because they've already shown to Adelbern that they've abandoned the kingdom. But they still want to keep the fight with the Char now that Rurik's gone. So they end up going north. They find refuge in the Eye of the North, the building up there, and that's where we meet them years later. So actually, if you think about it, Adelbern still doesn't really like these people. They had abandoned the kingdom back then. And you actually notice in this story here as well, it's got a line in there that basically says Adelbern has now heard of the successes of the Ebon Vanguard in the north. So the suggestion is these people were Rurik's vanguard. I think this is what I'm taking out of it. They were Rurik's vanguard and they've gone north now without really ever communicating with Adelbern or possibly even taking specific orders from him. They're just kind of doing their own thing, harassing the Char, and now finally Adelbern's accepted that they're doing well and he's come back with this fanfare, but maybe it was all just a big ruse to get them to go south and get them killed, which is an interesting thought. And that crossed my mind and I thought, that can't be. There must be some information out in Guild Wars 1 that specifically says Adelbern has told the Ebon Vanguard to do this. And my first thought was, during War in Kryta, the Crichtons actually go to the Ebon Vanguard for aid themselves. They go because they want help in taking out the White Mantle, and they speak to the then leader of the Ebon Vanguard, Captain Langmar. Evinia goes there, one of the high people in Kryta, and they have this conversation where Evinia is asking for aid from the Ebon Vanguard, and the Ebon Vanguard actually say, yes, we'll give you aid. But it's really interesting looking back at that conversation, because then she says, I on my end, yes, I'm happy to give you aid, but you have to confirm that with King Adelbern yourself. And Evinia's like, well, why can't we just have aid? I don't have time to be messing around with this. And Langmar pretty much says it's down to Adelbern in the end, not us. So it does still work, actually, from that scene at least. There might be some more information elsewhere that suggests Adelbern was condoning and leading the Ebon Vanguard from a distance, but from that scene it does still work. It seems that the Ebon Vanguard were just always operating outside of his control, which is a really cool thought, and it puts even more significance on that scene in Guild Wars 1, which I think in retrospect is turning out to be one of my favourite scenes between Crichtons and Ascalonians. Just the dynamics in the dialogue there is awesome. So anyway, there's that idea. I think that's kind of the thing I like to go with, that Adelbern was going a bit nuts. He didn't want doubters in the kingdom. He never really liked the Ebon Vanguard. He brings them back. They raise the morale of his troops, of the nation, as you hear quite a lot in the book about how everyone had been lulled into a false sense of security and so forth. And then he sends them south because at the end of the day, they did desert him once, and he sends them with a bunch of other people that were doubting their king, which more and more people slowly were. People were beginning to fear him too. And somehow he orchestrated these Char to be there down south, and I guess the idea was he wanted them all killed, but they defended themselves by tooth and nail, but they did manage to pull through, and they ended up fortifying there. And ironically, after all of that, it turns out that Adelbern had orchestrated the founding of the last defense of Ascalon, which I really love the idea of. He's going to lose his fight, the Char are going to keep pushing south, and eventually they'll be stalled at Ebonhawke, and I love that. I think that's so cool. So yeah, I mean, it could be wrong. The story obviously just raises the question. Maybe, I mean, another exciting possibility is that Adelbern knew of a different threat down there, not the Char. The Char just happened to be there. He knew of a different threat somehow. We know that come 250 years, that's where Kralkatorrik is very close to. I mean, you can just look at in-game, basically. You go to that mining area. There is a gate to the Crystal Desert, and it's pretty much where the brand starts to get pretty dangerous there. Did Adelbern somehow know? Did he have premonitions? I mean, we're stretching quite a bit here, but if he knew of some other threat, it certainly never made itself known. So anyway, I like the idea that he was just kind of playing with them, and he wanted them to die, and he was going a bit insane. So that's probably the more interesting thing that you can think about with the story. But a few other things spoke to me, particularly what they did with the characters. You get to see the conclusions of a lot of these character stories that you've met in Guild Wars 1. You probably didn't grow very attached to them, admittedly. It was hard to grow attached to many characters in Guild Wars 1. But still, they did do quite well at honouring certain things. So the first guy to die was Diane Fermati, and it's got that line in there that he died happy because he had one last drink of rum. You can go back and look at him in Guild Wars 1, and basically he spends all of his time drunk and talking about how he wants to go out with drinking competitions against Kilroy Stonekin, and how he loves dwarven ale and stuff. And then they obviously, ArenaNet went back, they looked at the character and they thought, okay, and they decided to keep that aspect of his personality in there even when he dies. I thought that was really cool, and they do that quite a lot. They mention certain characters, and maybe it's just a bit of fan service, I suppose, but it gets to me. I like it. I love that they mention Langmar, and they don't just mention Captain Langmar, who died and Gwen had taken over her, but they also mention her in such a way that it paints her as this great leader, and Gwen has managed to be a great successor in her footsteps, which in itself is a great thing to have done. So I love that they mention Langmar. And also, whenever Langmar gets mentioned, it reminds me of Evinia, who obviously is a big mystery right now too. So that makes me think, okay, if they're still thinking about Langmar, then they've obviously not forgotten about Evinia. Something will come out from her. So that was a nice moment for me too. I quite like that in the story. And then the story goes on, and they talk about how they're the warriors of the South, which again I really liked. I liked that kind of parallel between how the Ebon Vanguard, they were the warriors of the far north, and now there's this whole other chapter of the Ebon Vanguard's existence that we Guild Wars 1 players and Guild Wars 2 players to an extent never really got to participate in, and they were the warriors of the South for possibly longer than they ever were the warriors of the North. And I really like that complete contrast there. That's very cool, and I like the way that it was written in this story, because it does kind of bring that to light, and it's like, hey, think about this, and I thought that was quite cool. A bit further on, there was something kind of interesting. They mentioned specifically that Kieran was the one to choose the location of where they were going to fortify themselves, and then Gwen agreed, despite the fact Gwen's the leader and really probably she would be the one making that decision. I think they did this because in Guild Wars 1 they hinted at Kieran having a picnic location, a garden basically, a place like Gwen had in the far north, but Kieran had one somewhere near Ascalon, and for a long time we, the fans, thought, right, this is where Ebonhawke's going to get founded, we're going to go there in Guild Wars 1, and that never ended up happening. And obviously they've not confirmed that here, but I do think maybe they're hinting at that. Maybe it was Kieran's decision where we're going. How did he pick where he wants to go? Maybe it could have been that garden location that he spoke about in Guild Wars 1, but we never actually got to see. So I do think there's a little bit of that going on there, which I like. I like that they seem to have thought about quite a lot. There's a lot of things you can pick out in this story that it's great. I kind of wish that there were a lot more of these volumes. I feel like there should be one in every main city and one in every goddamn explorable in the game so that people can go and explore and look for all of them. An extra thing. It's like, okay, you've got points of interest, you've got vistas, you've got waypoints, and then you have like volumes of a specific book. That would be so cool. I would absolutely love that. Anyway, moving on, they go back to the characters as well a bit in the story. They mention Koro, and she dies. Obviously, she summons this big illusion, a bit like Queen Jenna kind of did, a bit along that side. There's a lot of stuff with big mesmer illusions, and then she gets rid of the chart, and she comes back blind. I love that, by the way. It's a very dark kind of image they paint there with her stumbling back, blood on her face, totally blinded, and then she dies. And it gets a bit darker than that, actually, because as she dies, it's got that she reminds Kieran, she dies in Kieran's arms, who'd obviously been leading her. She was an Ebon Falcon, so he was kind of responsible for her for a long time. She dies in her arms, and it mentions that she reminds him of a time previously when she'd summoned some other great illusion, right? And this is really cool, because you can go, again, back to Guild Wars 1, and you can look at this character's dialogue, this mesmer, and there's all this stuff about how she created the wedding dress for Gwen, or at least she picked it out, or it could have been an illusion she cast and stuff. But there's one line that she says, where basically she explains that Kieran Thackeray once fucked up. He completely messed up, right? And to get them out of the trouble, she had to summon a really big illusion that she describes as being about half the size of the Eye of the North, which is a massive, massive building, okay? So this is a big illusion. And even in Guild Wars 1, in that dialogue from all the way back there, it explains that by casting that, she was blinded for a week, and it was very unpleasant. It was kind of Kieran's fault. And now we look in this story, ArenaNet obviously looked back at that, and here they've said that she's dying, blinded, blood all over her, in his arms, and as she dies, she reminds him of the last time it happened when he failed and the same thing happened to her, but this time it was far worse. That's really depressing. You must have felt like crap to have been Kieran there. I love that. That's so good. And again, it's more service done to the stuff that they'd written back in Guild Wars 1, which I think is really cool. So I'm glad. I loved little lines like that, little parallels that they're throwing in there all the time. They really are at least putting in a bit of what that character was in Guild Wars 1, and they're not just kind of these nameless entities. You do remember that there were these things about them in the first game. And there's something a bit weird, I feel like, that they do afterwards. So we knew from lore that Gwen never created, and the Ebon Vanguard, they never created Ebonhawke, they just fortified a place that already existed. And in this story, we hear that Kieran picks a location in the mountains. We don't hear that there's anything at that location. Then we hear that they've set up a small camp there. Then we hear that it's a town, and that Nola Shepherd has summoned a load of undead from the previous occupants. So it's like, okay, is this the town that has been abandoned by people, or did she just go to a graveyard, or what? And it just kind of throws the word town in there as if we already knew they were in a town. And then later it then expands on that and says, oh, okay, no, this was a mining town. It's really weird the way they do that. They leave it very ambiguous, so it is hard to know specifically what's going on, because you can look at that in one light and say, oh no, they did found it entirely, and now it's just become known as a town because there's been a long passage of time and there's enough people there, or what. It's very confusing. I think obviously there was a place there earlier, because it does mention there were previous inhabitants that had died, but they don't make it clear, and I think they deliberately don't make it clear. I don't think they've quite worked out for themselves what exactly Ebonhawke was before the Ebon Vanguard got there. But yeah, that's a little bit messy, I suppose, in the story. It's a bit weird to kind of tell. It's not like Adelbern said, right, there's this town here, you're going to go and fortify it and you're going to go defend it. It's just go south and pick a location. So that was a little bit weird. That's the one thing I really would say was a bit off with this story, which is a bit of a shame. But another thing, probably my favourite bit, okay, so there's a nice mystery and cool thing to talk about with Adelbern, okay, but my favourite bit of this story is when you've got Nola Shepherd, right, the necromancer. She summons this massive army. We're going through the story, right, there's this character, oh shit, they've died. Now there's this character, oh shit, they've died. Now there's this character. What do we think? We jump to conclusions. We think that ArenaNet are going with formulas again. We think, right, okay, then this person's obviously going to die as well. This is Nola Shepherd, she's going to die. Boring. But actually, they don't do that. They break the formula. I love it. It's brilliant. So she summons this big army, and she's going to go out and get herself killed, and you're just kind of reading it like, yeah, that's not very compelling. But then they put in this really interesting situation that I think is very cool and kind of a complex thing that they don't really address elsewhere in the game. But then, like, Kieran Thackeray, the guy responsible for her, he tells her to get back, she disobeys, oh, she's just going to kill herself anyway, blah, blah, blah. But then he jumps over and he actually punches her out, he knocks her out and then drags her back. And you might think, well, that's a non-story there. It's, oh, she was going to do it, then she doesn't do it, and that's it. There's nothing compelling or interesting there. But actually, I think that it was really good that ArenaNet left that in and put that detail in there, because it shows a certain other side of the conflict against the Char. It shows that they are having to turn on one another. This guy has just had to knock this woman out to stop her from killing herself. That's a really cool little situation. It's quite dark, it's quite complicated, and you can kind of just tell just from that one line that happened. There would have been some interesting conversations or relationships going on between Nola and Kieran after that, and it kind of shows how he's developed as a character, and he's not pussyfooting around. Maybe he never pussyfooted around when it came to war. We never really knew that. We just knew he did when it came to romancing Gwen. So I really liked this. It showed that side of Kieran. It showed that side of the conflict, that people fight each other. And again, it broke the formula, which I think is the best thing about it, because I was just expecting her to die, and I was going to be like, oh, this is just an excuse to show us how all the characters die. It wasn't. We don't know how Nola died in the end, but we do know there was this cool moment there in the story where she maybe lost hope and she was going to get herself killed to try and save everyone, but Kieran stood out and he knocked her out. He knew best, and he saved her life basically by hitting her, which is cool. And that as I say, I don't think you really get much of that in Guild Wars. So that's probably my favourite moment of the story. I think that's probably the coolest little bit, aside from obviously what the hell's going on with Adelbern. I think that whole story with Adelbern going insane over the death of his son is really good, and I love that ArenaNet expanded on that after Guild Wars 1 was finished, because it was in Guild Wars 1 just, oh, I hate my son. There was a lot of stuff outside of the game in the manuscripts and stuff that kind of expanded on it, but it was just, oh, we don't like each other, okay, Rurik's dead now, game over. And then you never really heard much else about Adelbern. You interacted with him a few times, but you didn't really hear that much else about him. And then they've developed that a lot more with the book, like Ghost of Ascalon develops it loads, and here in game as well they're developing it a bit more. I really like that, the madness of the king after realising that he's fucked his life up by alienating his son and not taking his advice and watching his kingdom fall around him. I really, really do like that. Anyway, towards the end, we get this image that they paint. This was another cool thing that I quite liked. They put in the line about how they could see the Char pacing on the horizon. Like, this is the first time they see that sight. They can look out on the horizon and they see the Char there waiting to come back. And they specifically put that in. I think that's really cool, because a big part of Ebonhawke, you don't see it in Guild Wars 2 because of the treaty. But pretty much the entire lifetime of this, as it existed as a military stronghold, you could always see the Char on the horizon. There was always this stalemate. There was this line that was drawn, the siege engine of the Char, just out of range of the catapults and stuff on the walls of Ebonhawke, and it was always there. And it's kind of, they put that line in there, this is when it began. This is when the Char on the horizon could first be seen, and it remained that way for a good 200 years on that. And I think that's really cool. I like that they threw that line in there. It's a good nod towards that, which I think might go over a couple of people's heads if they haven't read the books or whatever, but that's kind of what it's getting at there, that you will, from it forevermore really, the Char will be seen on this horizon. And it's been established this is Ebonhawke, this is the life they now live. In general, I like the story. I think it's a good send-off to Gwen and Kieran, who have kind of got these big legacies in Guild Wars 2 now. There's a lot of like Char stories about Gwen the warmonger, and she gets this big fanfare. And I feel like a lot of players are just like, well, what did she do? She didn't really do that much. Well, this might go a little bit to alleviate that. It's nice that she gets a bit of attention, but then it's not, the story wasn't written by Gwen. It was just by someone else who was experiencing it, and she was just kind of in there by proxy. And I think that was cool, because she didn't take the spotlight, but at the same time, she did get a bit more attention that she might have needed, in the right kind of attention, to actually make people realise she was a big player in these things. And the same can be said for Kieran as well. Kieran, to an extent, has kind of just felt like a character that was just thrown in there to push Gwen's story forward, but he kind of comes out in his own here. He makes some of these big decisions. He has these moments like where he knocks out Nola, which I think is quite nice. Really, though, all this really reminded me of that I thought was nicest about those two characters in particular is that Logan, it just makes you think of Logan. Logan is their descendant, directly descended from these two characters. He bears the same second name. Logan Thackeray has Kieran Thackeray's second name. And it's really cool to think then about Logan's true Ascalonian heritage. This is such an Ascalonian story. It's all about Ascalon and the Char, and this is nothing to do with Kryta. Kryta's struggles don't come into it. But now we have Logan, who's this massive character, but he's so steeped in Crichton stuff, and I love that now you can still draw this connection that really he is Ascalonian in his blood, at least to some extent. It's probably been diluted as he's been, you know, with other Crichtons have joined the bloodline throughout the years, but still, I really liked that and thinking about Logan, and obviously in the book about certain stuff that happens in Ebonhawke with Logan, which I won't spoil. It's just good. It's good to think about Logan while he's there and really his ties to that place and how his ancestors really founded it in this way. So yeah, that's the story. I really enjoyed this. This is definitely going to be in a different video, this commentary here. I really loved it. Probably one of the really nice things about this is you're reading this story, especially as a Guild Wars 1 player, I would say, but if you're only a Guild Wars 2 player, you might be able to rally behind it anyway. And it's all about, it brings you back to the fight against the Char, which was so much of what it was to be a Guild Wars 1 player, particularly a Prophecies player. And you really start to rally behind it, and you're reading this really kind of motivational book about, yes, we're standing against the Char are fuckers, they're beasts, they're monsters, and then at the same time you're running around Ebonhawke and you're listening to the separatists that are kind of being portrayed as enemies, and we're supposed to be against the separatists, but you really can sympathise with them. Ebonhawke is one of my favourite places in the game just for this, because I sympathise with the separatists. I really do. They've really done very well at making you see both sides of the coin in this particular struggle, with the people that want to continue fighting the Char, and a lot of the little dialogues you can give to the separatists where you speak to them and they give their reasons about all their loved ones that have died and how they don't want the treaty to come through, and they really are quite convincing. You, the character, are quite convincing too, and obviously you have to take the side of being against the separatists, which it feels a bit weird, honestly, but I think that's a good thing that feels weird, because you're reading this book and it's a very bizarre experience, kind of rallying behind this cause of fighting the Char, and now you're in this bizarre world 250 years later where this treaty's just happened, and there are all these people that don't like it, and it's your job to be talking them out of it. It's cool. It really is a nice experience. That's one of the nice things I took away from reading this book, just because obviously I think that's why you are yo-yoing around the city. I think that's why they did it, so like volume 1's in one corner and volume 2's in the freaking other opposite corner. Well, the first 5 volumes are all in the same house, but I think that's why they did it, to make you walk around Ebonhawke a lot, because you just soak it in. I had to mute the soundtrack of the other video, because as I was going around there was so much talking from the separatists and stuff, shouting stuff out, that was at the end of the day interesting, but it was going over the commentary of the actual story, so I had to mute it. It's all over them. It's a great town, it really is. I'm looking forward to when we get to go to the Crystal Desert. As I said before, I think that it will become a bit more of a hub of activity then. We might have some more stuff to do because the gate is so close, but yeah, it's certainly one of the highlights. I did find out about the locations of one of these volumes a very long time ago. I wanted to put a video out a long time ago, but I just got distracted with stuff because I've been playing this game way too much, so now at last finally it's out. Let me know what you thought about it, guys, and I guess I'll see you next time for whatever's coming up. Thanks very much, and I'll see you later.